Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. We're with Brother Ali Harfouch, and today we're going to discuss who's who amongst the Syrian opposition. The media often tries to paint all the opposition with the same brush, but the reality is that there's many different factions out there, and I think it's necessary for us to know who the players are so that we know what really are the demands of the Syrian revolution. And inshallah, Brother Ali today is going to address this and provide us with evidence, inshallah.
Inshallah ta'ala. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. I think the fundamental problem in dealing with the opposition in Syria, or in trying to understand the opposition in Syria, is some of the generalizing categories that have been used by the media. So, for example, when we listen to whether it's CNN, Al Jazeera, and Arabiya, we always hear, for example, the Free Syrian Army carried out such and such, or the opposition carried out such and such, the rebels carried out such and such. And, for example, we also hear things such as the opposition met with, let's say, Lavrov, the opposition met with Ahmadinejad, the opposition met with Barack Obama's political aides, and so forth. So if there's this reductive fallacy in dealing with the opposition, essentially what happens is they take a very complex situation, a very diverse range of opposition movements in Syria, which range up about to 1,000 brigades, right, 1,000 fighting factions, and they reduce it into one category, right? And within this category, you have Islamists, ranging from the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, Jabhat an-Nussrah, all the way to neoliberal opposition, neoliberally inclined opposition thinkers, socialists, and many of what we call al-mu'arad al-kharija, opposition which is outside Syria, which is generally secular in nature. So when Al Jazeera, for example, comes and says the rebels have captured this city, and at the same time the rebels have cut a tie with, for example, Qatar, right? This leads to a generalization, right? And this obscures what's really happening in the ground. So again, just before I answer your question about who's who, it's important that we go beyond the reductive fallacy, right, and understand that it's a very diverse opposition. And it's important also that we do not fall into a generalization fallacy, where we take one opposition movement, right, for example, which is external to Syria, and which has never represented the Syrian population and has never gained popularity. For example, the secular opposition, which tried to create a civil society in 2001 in what was called the Damascus Spring, and it was repressed. It was a very small movement. So we should never conflate the two. Now, if we want to discuss who's who in the Syrian revolution, it's important.
Well, just before we move on to that, so is it fair for us to say that the opposition that the media constantly points to, in fact, has no roots in the Syrian revolution?
Yes, this is on two grounds. First and foremost, the political opposition, right, which was represented by Mu'adh Khatib, then Hito, and then Ahmad Jabra today, has no roots whatsoever in Syria. And if it does have any grounding in Syria, it's very weak. Had it had grounding in Syria, the US would have intervened long ago. Had the US been able to secure a native elite who would represent US interests, it would have led an airstrike far early on into the revolution. So that's the first, what I would call, clear indicator that the secular opposition outside Syria has no grounding inside Syria. And many times we also hear about, for example, the Free Syrian Army carried out such and such. It's also important to note that the Free Syrian Army is not the rebels. It's not to be conflated with all the rebels.
Okay.
The Free Syrian Army is one of 8 fighting brigades, one of 8 main fighting brigades in the Syrian revolution. And as a matter of fact, there are actually, if one wants to look at it from a strategic perspective, they've had a weak influence on the revolution in and of itself. So, for example, if we look at the battle for North Syria, right? If we look at the recent battle to take over al-Ladiqiyya, right, to take over the coast of Syria, we see that this was led by Islamists, whether it's Jabhat an-nussrah, Ansar al-Sham, Sufur al-Sham, Dawla al-Islamiyya fi Iraq al-Sham, and so forth. Whereas the Free Syrian Army, or what's loosely called the Free Syrian Army, and now it's referred to as the military councils, but even these are tottering as we speak. Didn't have really any influence in these key battles. But of course, at the end of the day, they're considered by, unfortunately, for example, Qatari-backed news outlets like Al Jazeera and Saudi-backed agencies such as Al Arabiya, they're considered to be the face of the revolution. So when we look beyond the rhetoric of Al Jazeera, we see something completely different to what's actually happening on the ground.
So is it fair to say that the FSA's soldiers, foot soldiers, are Islamists? Largely
the inclination of all the rebels in Syria, right? All the rebels in Syria is Islamist, and they have this Islamic inclination, and this is very clear, right? And this has been almost a unanimous conclusion by pro-Syrian news outlets and and pro-revolution media outlets. The inclination of some of the inclination of the majority of the Free Syrian Army fighters, yes, is Islamist. However, the problem is with the leadership. The problem is with the leadership, and it was precisely because these brigades and these fighting members had this Islamic inclination that the external opposition had to step in and create something called the military council, the MCs, right, in different provinces in Syria. So essentially, this MC, right, not MC Hammer, the military councils, they were essentially the link between the external opposition and the brothers fighting on the ground. But even this military council, which is led by Salim Idrisi, it's failing, and 4 out of 5 of the heads of this opposition of this military council have threatened to resign in the recent days.
Okay, now we've heard that the Islamists are really the ones winning the battles on the ground, and that the FSA is actually tailing behind.
Exactly.
And the truth of the matter is that the Islamists are not one, and the brigades usually have control of certain locales, and maybe there's an agenda that unifies them, but there are some differences. And what are those key differences that we need to focus on?
The key differences, in my opinion, are more strategic than ideological. They're more related to how do we administer certain areas and so forth. So for example, if one looks at the differences between Ahrar al-Sham, which also is Salafi jihadi oriented, and for example Jabhat an-Nussrah, they would see that it's more of a logistical and administrative and strategic differences. The way, for example, the way in which Ahrar al-Sham tries to win over its population, win over the areas it controls, is different than, for example, some of the methods used by Jabhat an-Nussrah. Not to mention that the discourse is slightly different in that maybe Jabhat an-Nussrah has a more universal or more international global discourse, right, which associates itself with the global jihadi movement, whereas Ahrar al-Sham is more localized. So the differences are more strategic and discourse based than ideological.
But is it fair to say that Jabhat al-Nusra is really the leader in all these, in all these military offensives?
No, unfortunately, the media has this obsession with focusing its spotlight on 2 groups.
And the reason why?
Jabhat al-Nusra and the Free Syrian Army. And to try to make it seem as there's this dichotomy, right, and this radical break between the moderates and between the Islamists. And we've seen this Islamist, this radical moderate dichotomy, these categories, these binaries being used as early as the 1980s. It's just a strategy being reused to try to divide the revolution and try to break up the revolution and try to create a moderate fighting faction, right, which can eventually marginalize the more quote-unquote radical groups. But in reality, their lines are much more blurred. That's one. 2, Jabhat al-Nusra is not the only group on the ground. Jabhat al-Nusra, as I said, is one of 8 groups. You also have Ahrar al-Sham, and according to many analysts, Ahrar al-Sham is the leading fighting brigade in Syria. And Ahrar al-Sham is very well respected by all the different brigades, whether it's Liwa al-Tawheed, Liwa al-Islam, who are more quote-unquote, according to a neoliberal paradigm, who are more moderate, and they're also very well respected, and they cooperate with other groups which are considered radical according, of course, from a Western paradigm, like the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham.
So where does where do the opposition all meet? What is the unifying force?
There's 2 fundamental pillars, 2 fundamental ideas which unite the rebels. 1, the complete removal of the existing Syrian power structure. This does not mean just Bashar al-Assad, but this means the whole political system must be uprooted, right? And if one looks at the manifestos of all the brigades, he'll see this explicitly, right? And this is actually reassuring that we know that the fighting brigades will not recreate the Egyptian scenario, will not recreate the Libyan scenario, and so forth. So 1, an uprooting of the Ba'athist system, that's first. And second of all, an Islamic alternative.